Hi, John. Welcome to the podcast and thanks for joining us.
David, many thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here.
We're talking today about cybersecurity in the boardroom. And John, a good place to start really would be to talk about whether it's taken seriously enough at that level, especially given the amount of media coverage about security breaches. Is cyber still a problem in the boardroom from the perspective of the people that sit there?
So obviously you can make a sweeping generalization about how people see things at the boardroom. It does of course differ from organization to organization. But I think from what I've seen is that yes, cybersecurity is taken seriously. Boards are full of intelligent people and who understand the context and who are widely read, as you say, and they will have read about the security breaches. I think, though, there are still maybe some questions at the board level about what difference they can make to cybersecurity. I think perhaps the other factor here is that maybe in some organizations, they may believe that they themselves would not be a target for whatever reasons. But I do think because of the media coverage that cyber is increasingly becoming elevated to become an issue for boards to consider.
And is there a range? I imagine that some organisations are very well tuned in. It's on every agenda, and others are less so. There's perhaps a difference of how important this is to different organisations and their boards.
Yeah, I think absolutely right. I think that, and it's right that it should be that because some organisations are more digitally dependent than others. Some organisations will be operating in sectors such as defence or working with government, where they will know that they're at a higher risk. For many organisations, they may be holding sensitive data, perhaps data which is relating to individuals, which a regulatory breach could be both reputationally damaging but also extremely expensive. So, yes, the how seriously it's taken will depend on the sort of organisation and their role. I think the one thing which I'll say is that I think we've got to all reflect that as a result of the panic, we are all as individuals, but also as companies, more digitally dependent. And perhaps we haven't really thought through some of the risks and the impacts if we were to lose either data or access to systems.
And would it be fair to say in some of the most extreme cases, perhaps it doesn't really get to be a regular topic until there's been a serious breach?
Yeah, well, I think absolutely. Everybody sees these things in a different way after you've experienced a breach. When we look at what at the highest level a board or the executive management team are seeking to do, they're seeking to find the right balance between security, usability, and cost. And those are three things which you've got to get right. And it obviously depends on your view on the risk. But I think post an incident, people are much more likely to be aware of the cost aspects of the breach. And those costs are often, dramatically higher than it would have been to have perhaps put in place some of the mitigation which might have stopped the attack in the first place.
And I'm wondering to what extent this might have to do with mindset. I mean, we've talked on the Glasswall blog before about the importance of leadership mindset. Does some senior people suffer from the illusion that it's mainly a technology issue and then they don't engage with it as much as they might?
So again, there can be a difference from organisation to organisation. Many boards, particularly if they're a digital organisation, there will be not an issue understanding detailed technology issues. I think as a sweeping generalisation, there is a risk that cybersecurity is something that is left to the CIO and the CISO to resolve, and that's how it's dealt with. I think one of the most important points that we should be stressing is that actually cybersecurity is a board issue, and there are a number of things that we can do to make sure the board understands it, and that also the board is presented with the information, the decisions in such a way as though they feel involved. And we can certainly explore some of those later.
And I know you've seen and worked with many organisations that have been coping with the aftermath of an attack. I mean, can you in perhaps in general terms talk about the practical impact of what happens to organisations and perhaps their boards when they have a serious breach?
Yeah, of course. And I suppose it's worth mentioning, David, that there can be a difference between how a UK board operates, which is primarily around assurance, and a US board where perhaps there's more of a role, an executive type role. I'll try and sort of focus on the assurance piece because that's where my experience has been. So the important thing is that when a cyber attack, in advance of a cyber attack, I think it's pretty important the board has got some assurance around issues such as, have we exercised for an attack? Have we got an offline secure backup? Have we practiced recovering from a cyber incident? And of course, all of those other questions about, when have we had penetration testing? What are the risks that we're most worried about, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to actually dealing with the attack, then I think the board has got a role of both supporting the executive, but also challenging. And so what are the sorts of questions that should be asked in that challenging role? Well, I think the board, because they themselves are not going to be actively managing it, it's going to be left to the executive, will want to go and see evidence that somebody is clearly in charge. And so what do I mean by that? But it is that you have to have somebody who is running the incident on behalf of the CEO. I think the board would also want to be confident. Again, this is not left just to the CIO. The reality is that any cyber incident clearly has a vital technical element, and resolving the technical challenges will be crucial. But there's an impact on the business, and it's the consequences of an attack on the relationship with customers, with the reputation, which is something which can only be managed if the whole of the organisation is involved in responding. I think something else that the board will be very keen to understand, but also to contribute to, is how are the communications going? Are we getting the message right? Can the board, for example, help with some of the engagement with other senior stakeholders who really matter to things? So I think those are some of the sorts of questions that the board should be asking the executive during a cyber incident.
Okay. And are there situations in the public and private sectors directly comparable? Are the issues exactly the same? Do those different areas face, the leadership of those different areas face different kinds of challenges and priorities?
Well, I think there's definitely emerging. So, for example, an organisation that is working in the critical national infrastructure will be much more tightly regulated and will be working to very tight rules in the same way as government will be. But ultimately, people are, as I said earlier, having to still make judgments around the balance between risk and security and the threats and the usability of systems. So in many ways, I think it's the same issues for both the private and the public sector. But as we move forward, it's clear that within the public sector, whilst the impact might not be financially important, there's still the same reputational damage. There's still the potential loss of confidence from the people who use those services and who will sign up to make their data available.
Okay, and perhaps shifting tack a bit and thinking about issues related to improvements and best practice at board level. One of the things that occurs to me is that obviously the boardroom has a huge influence on organisational culture. And I wonder whether you thought if leaders sometimes underestimate the role of an effective cybersecurity culture on their overall protection levels.
Yeah, I think the board showing how seriously they take cybersecurity is really, really important. And one of the things that the board needs to, I think, really be clear and to write down is what is the tolerance of risk. So I take as an example within the NHS. The NHS holds some highly sensitive data about us all and a vast amount of it. So very much the steer from NHS Digital Board is that there's an extremely low tolerance of risk, and that's got to be communicated down to everybody so that they understand when they're making some of those decisions that it's clear that we must err on the side of caution when making some of these change. But there's also, it's a point there which is a leadership issue, isn't it? Which is around, how whether the board gives enough time for cyber security. Whether, some of the measures that impose, such as multi-factor, two-factor authentication, whether everybody employs them, including in a leadership role, because they can make life more complex. Whether the senior management team and the board have gone through a cyber exercise and shared the results of those. And, most importantly, whether they've taken an interest in that. And I think there is here a really helpful way of tackling this is to have, for example, a non-executive director who has a role assuring cybersecurity and who is a champion for it, and who maybe then perhaps spend time with the security teams and with others to understand, but also to support those teams.
Okay, and the thorny subject of money and investment in cybersecurity. I'm sure there's a big variance again, but in general terms, are boards investing enough? And this might be related to how seriously they take the issue. But are they spending money on the right things?
Well, David, you've got a dramatically different spends. If you say, for example, if you look at the financial sector, then there is a very high level of spend. And in healthcare, though, it tends to be much lower because, the reality being that you're spending money on IT, and cybersecurity, which could be spent on people's heart bypasses or, helping to tackle, backlogs of people needing, urgent treatment. So there is some sweeping, variations between different sorts of organizations. In terms of what they're spending the money on, it may be appropriate to be spending the money on cybersecurity, but it may actually be better to spend the money on replacing the IT, not having legacy IT, which is untrustworthy and which can be exploited. I think for board to understand whether they are investing in it enough, this is clearly where they need the advice from the CIO and the CISO. And what questions do they need put to them? Well, they need to understand what are we most concerned about. They need to understand what are the main cyber risks that we're facing and the things that and the vulnerabilities that we've got, and what is the plan to address those vulnerabilities. And when they look at the spending is, are we going to spend X amount, and how quickly can we address those vulnerabilities? How much risk are we carrying? And does that correspond with our risk tolerance? So I think you've got to go through that sort of process as a board to be able to understand whether you are spending the money on the right things and whether the level of investment is appropriate given the data and the value of the systems that you are holding. I think the problem is that sometimes not enough organizations go through that process.
But if we assume for a second that has taken place and organizations have, are more or less in the appropriate position regarding their spend, in practical terms, are there some steps that boards can take in a wider sense to improve their approach to cybersecurity and as a board, and consequently that of their organisations?
So I think that there are some things which they can do or they can ask to happen, which will give them a sense of the organisation's cybersecurity, and they will want the executive to do. So one of the things which I think is really important is third-party assurance for example, from penetration testing. Getting a third party to look at you and see the risks that you're carrying can be really, really helpful for a board. And then allows you to have a conversation with the executive, with the CIO, to go and understand whether you have got the right things in place. What I would like to do at this point is make a plug for National Cybersecurity Centre's board toolkit. This is a really helpful way for the board to frame the questions that they should be asking of the executive. And it covers issues such as, patching, and how do we defend ourselves against phishing emails? What are the defenses that can be put in place? Have we got those? And in addition to the questions, there are also some really helpful advice on what good answers look like and sources of information for board members to go and do it. So I really commend the NCSC's guidance in the space.
And where can people go to find that, John?
So go to ncsc.gov.uk. I've also got to make a plug for anybody from the NHS. We've done some work recently, NHS Digital and NHSX, creating a guide for non-executive directors working in the NHS. And it not only sort of builds on the NCSC guidance, but it also gives some sense of what's provided by NHS Digital and NHSX to allow non-execs to understand the resources that are available to them and help them understand the risks that they're taking.
So for those organisations that make use of resources like those and wider sources of advice, what does good practice look like? I mean, I'm sure you've seen many examples of bad practice, but in when it all comes together and works, what does good practice look like?
So I think what we're looking at here is effective assurance. So we're looking at effective challenge of the executive to make sure that the work being put in place reflects the importance of digital technology to the success of the business. Now, you can spend a vast amount of money, defending something which perhaps doesn't need that much. That doesn't happen very often. But getting that balance right and constantly reviewing it. This isn't something which you can just stop. So I think good practice is about regularly reviewing. And there are a number of different ways that this can be done. It can be done by a board subcommittee. I think it is really valuable, and certainly we do this NHS Digital, that we use every board meeting. We do have an update on cyber, but we also do deep dives into issues that are of particular concern. And as I say, we take it back each time to those questions around what are we most worried about? What are the vulnerabilities that we're having to deal with, and how are we getting on with addressing them and measuring the progress? As I say, I think different organisations, depending on the size, will want to look at the governance. But I do think it's important that as part of that governance, we recognise that there can be a tension between IT delivery and IT security. That's why I think it is really good practice to have a chief information security officer. And that they probably won't be on the board. It depends on the organisation. But we need, I think, a sort of independent way of them reporting to make sure that we have got that appropriate degree of challenge.
Okay. And I'd just like to circle back round to an issue you touched on before, which is the specific challenge of legacy technology and technology infrastructure. Obviously, some organisations are operationally very wedded to older technology because it still does the job. But are some boards hamstrung from a security perspective by their reliance on legacy tech?
So absolutely, legacy is a major problem because, as I said earlier, you've got to treat it as untrustworthy. If it can't be updated, it is vulnerable. I think, to be fair to organisations, it's not so much that they are wedded to it. It can just be very, very difficult to move off it, and there can be some significant costs, but also significant risks of being unable to move away from it. It could, for example, be operational technology. And in the healthcare sector, we have medical devices, which unfortunately cannot be updated. I think we have to recognise that legacy is a major issue. Replacing it, as I say, can be extremely expensive, but it's got to be treated as though it's untrustworthy. And if it cannot be replaced, then I think the board will want to understand. Indeed, it's one of the board questions from the National Cybersecurity Centre. You'll want to have assurance that mitigation have been put in place. Is there has it been segmented so it is not exposed to the internet? And these sorts of issues can, of course, also be brought out through penetration testing, where we can go and see it. So everybody has to recognise it's a risk, and you want to go and move off it. But we've also got to recognise there can be financial and practical issues which make that more difficult. But there has to be a plan if there's going to be a delay in being able to address it. There has to be a plan in the short term to mitigate it.
Clearly, here at Glasswall, we're very interested in the specific risks of file-based threats, and CDR, content disarm and reconstruction technology, plays an important role in defeating them. From your perspective, is this one of the areas that boards should be paying more attention to?
So you're absolutely right. CDR technology can really help. I think it can help to with regard to phishing attacks and threats which are contained within different sorts of files. That can be important. It's also got a role to play in some of the approaches for network segmentation. So yeah, it's got a role. I'm not sure whether it would be a board which would focus on that. I think that would be down to CIOs and CISOs to think about the specific technical assurance, but explain in terms of the response that the CIO and the CISO will give back about how mitigation been put in place. And I think CDR definitely has a role.
John, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you very much for your time.
Dave, thanks to you, and thanks to everybody at Glasswall.